What if the person you loved, trusted, and built your future with wasn't really in love with you at all? What if, instead, they saw you as a ticket, a stepping stone, a shortcut to something far bigger than you ever imagined? That's the question that hangs over Trevor Engelson's life, a man who thought he had found love, only to discover that he was part of a much bigger game. At 48, Trevor has finally admitted the truth. Meghan Markle, before she became the Duchess of Sussex, before she captured the world's attention with royal pageantry, used him to get ahead in Hollywood. And once she had climbed high enough, she let go without looking back. Does that shock you? Or does it confirm what so many have suspected all along? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because here's the thing, this story isn't just about a failed marriage. It's about betrayal, ambition, and the way Hollywood chews people up while rewarding those who know how to play the game. It's about a man who gave everything, his love, his support, his professional connections, only to realize he had been outmaneuvered by someone with eyes fixed on a much bigger prize. Trevor Engelson isn't a household name like Meghan. He's not splashed across magazines, walking red carpets, or delivering speeches to global audiences. But behind the scenes, he's been an insider in Hollywood for decades, a producer who knew how to make things happen. And when Meghan came into his life, she wasn't yet the polished, global celebrity we know today. She was struggling. She was another actress hoping for her big break, battling rejection after rejection. And in Trevor, she saw more than a boyfriend. She saw an opportunity. But let's pause for a moment. Can you imagine what it feels like to realize, years later, that your love story was never really about love? That every romantic dinner, every late-night pep talk, every industry contact you introduced her to might not have been about building a life together, but about building her ladder out of obscurity? That's where the emotional sting of Trevor's revelation cuts deepest. He wasn't just betrayed as a husband. He was betrayed as a partner in her career. Think about it. Hollywood is brutal. Thousands of actors chase auditions every day. Most will never get a speaking role, let alone a recurring character on a major television show. Meghan knew this. She'd been in the trenches, hustling for years, bouncing from small parts to minor gigs. But unlike many others, Meghan had something they didn't. A man already embedded in the business, someone who could get her in rooms she couldn't reach on her own. And Trevor gave her that. He opened those doors. He vouched for her. He became her biggest champion. At first, it looked like the kind of story we all want to believe in. The producer falls in love with the actress, helps her succeed, and together they rise. A Hollywood romance for the ages. But here's the twist. While Trevor thought they were rising together, Meghan was already planning to rise beyond him. That's where the contradictions begin. On one hand, Meghan was the doting partner in public, walking red carpets with Trevor, smiling at his side. On the other, she was positioning herself in rooms where Trevor's presence was no longer required. And it raises a hard question. When does support turn into exploitation? We've all been there in smaller ways, haven't we? Maybe you helped a friend get a job interview, only to watch them ignore you once they landed the role. Or maybe you've poured your energy into someone's dreams, only to realize they were never as invested in yours. Scale that up to Hollywood, and you begin to understand the level of betrayal Trevor must have felt. But why does this matter now, in 2025? Because Trevor, now 48, has finally spoken with clarity. He no longer hides behind silence, no longer shrugs it off as just a failed marriage. He's admitted that Meghan used him, not just emotionally, but strategically. And that confession shines a light not only on their relationship, but on the persona Meghan has built since. Imagine Trevor back then, the Hollywood producer who thought he had found his forever. He and Meghan married in 2011 at a lavish wedding in Jamaica. Friends described it as a wild, fun-filled affair. On the surface, it was love. But behind the laughter, the cocktails, and the beachfront photos, the seeds of ambition were already planted. Trevor wanted a partner. Meghan wanted a platform. And when she got her breakthrough role on Suits, a role she may never have landed without Trevor's influence, everything began to change. Let's pause here and think about the irony. Trevor was the one who had the industry credibility. He had been working with studios, making projects happen. Meghan was the newcomer. Yet, once she had the exposure, once her name was tied to a successful TV series, she no longer needed him. In fact, Some would argue he became a liability to her next stage of ambition. That's the cruel irony of ambition, isn't it? The very people who lift you up are often the first ones you outgrow or discard. And discard she did. We'll get to that part, the infamous moment when Meghan mailed back her wedding ring instead of facing Trevor in person. But for now, think about the slow unraveling that came before that. The small moments where Trevor realized she wasn't as invested as he was. The dinners she skipped for networking events. The phone calls cut short because a bigger opportunity was waiting. The way her eyes shifted from him to the horizon of her next big break. It's devastating. And it begs a question to you watching right now. Have you ever felt like someone loved the version of you that could help them, not the version of you that needed love in return? Trevor's truth is more than gossip. It's a cautionary tale about ambition unchecked, about what happens when relationships are treated like rungs on a ladder instead of bonds of trust. At 48, he's not the angry ex-husband, bitter about losing a wife. He's a man who has finally accepted that the love he thought he had was, in fact, a transaction. And that's where this story cuts deeper than most royal dramas or Hollywood scandals. Because it's not just about Meghan leaving him. It's about what she gained from him, and how she left when she no longer needed what he had to offer. But here's where the story twists again. Trevor isn't just exposing Meghan for the sake of revenge. He's exposing a system. He's peeling back the curtain on how Hollywood rewards users, how the industry thrives on people who know how to leverage relationships for power. And Meghan, in Trevor's eyes, played that game better than anyone. But before we dive into the rise of Meghan Markle and the role Trevor played in her breakthrough, there's one detail you need to know. A detail Trevor himself admits still haunts him. Because while Meghan may have used him to climb, the way she chose to leave him behind was colder, sharper, and more devastating than anything he could have imagined. And that's where our story begins to take its darkest turn. What kind of love story begins with laughter on a beach and ends with a wedding ring mailed back in an envelope? What kind of marriage transforms from promises of forever into silence, absence, and a cold goodbye? That's the haunting contradiction at the center of Trevor Engelson's story. He didn't just lose a wife. He lost a dream he thought was real. But before the heartbreak, before the shock of that mailed ring, there was a beginning. A beginning that seemed full of charm, serendipity, and the intoxicating possibility of a Hollywood romance. Trevor was already part of Hollywood's inner machinery. He wasn't a celebrity whose face was splashed on tabloids, but he was the kind of man everyone in the business knew. He was the fixer, the connector, the one who could get projects moving when others stalled. To some, he was the man behind the curtain, a producer with a reputation for pulling strings. To Meghan, he was everything she didn't have yet: credibility, access, and a lifeline into an industry that often chewed up actresses before they even got their first speaking line. Their first encounter wasn't marked by flashing cameras or royal fanfare. It was ordinary, almost unremarkable, the kind of meeting you'd forget, unless you were Meghan. Unless you saw potential where others saw coincidence. She was beautiful, yes, but more importantly, she was ambitious. Ambition shines in a way that doesn't need words. It lingers in the eyes, sharpens the tone of voice, and gives off the quiet hum of someone who will not be denied. Meghan had that, and Trevor noticed it immediately. Now, think about this for a second. How many of us have mistaken ambition for passion? How many of us have seen someone's relentless drive and confused it with love for us? That's the mistake Trevor made. In the early days, Meghan played the part of the supportive girlfriend perfectly. She laughed at his jokes. She hung on his stories about the industry. She soaked up every detail about scripts, casting decisions, and the politics of producers and directors. But Trevor didn't see what she was really doing: studying, learning, absorbing. Every conversation was another layer of training, another step in her unspoken strategy. And Trevor, blinded by affection, offered it all willingly. You can almost picture it, can't you? Late-night dinners where Trevor explained how casting agents think, why some auditions work and others don't. Meghan listening carefully, nodding, her eyes not just filled with love, but with calculation. Did Trevor realize in those moments that he wasn't just confiding in a partner? He was tutoring someone who would soon outgrow him? Of course not. When you're in love, suspicion feels like betrayal. You give the benefit of the doubt. You assume the best. That was Trevor's first mistake. Because Meghan wasn't just another struggling actress. She was a struggling actress with a blueprint. The pattern became clear in hindsight, but at the time, it felt natural. Trevor would invite her to events, introduce her to casting directors, whisper encouragement before auditions. He believed in her when the industry didn't. And that's the cruel irony, isn't it? The one person who gave her unwavering support was the same person she'd later discard. Let me ask you, if you had a partner who cheered you on, opened doors for you, and helped you climb, would you see them as your equal or as a rung on the ladder? For Meghan, Trevor was both. A partner in bed, a rung in business. And yet, at first, it looked so romantic. Their friends described them as inseparable. They were the couple that had fun, laughed easily, and seemed to balance each other out. Trevor, grounded and pragmatic. Meghan, charming and aspirational. It was the kind of chemistry that makes outsiders say, they're perfect for each other. But perfection is rarely perfect. The first signs came quietly. A missed dinner here. An industry party where Trevor stood in the background while Meghan charmed the room. At first, it looked like normal Hollywood ambition. But Trevor began to notice something. Meghan wasn't just chasing roles, she was chasing people. She wasn't content to audition. She wanted to be remembered. She wanted to be noticed by the right people, in the right rooms, at the right time. And Trevor? He was her ticket in. Can you see the contradiction? A producer who thought he was falling in love, and an actress who was falling in line with her strategy. Two people walking side by side, but toward completely different destinations. That's the tragedy of Trevor's confession. He believed they were building a future together. She believed she was building her future through him. Think of it this way. If love is supposed to be a partnership, then Trevor was running a relay race without realizing it. He carried the baton, sprinted hard, and when he passed it to Meghan, she never passed it back. She just kept running. And the finish line? Suits. But before we jump ahead to that golden ticket, let's stay in those early days a moment longer. Picture Trevor inviting Meghan to industry mixers, shaking hands with casting directors, watching Meghan shine in conversations where she dropped little hints about her dream roles. Picture him standing proudly at her side, not realizing that each of those nights wasn't just about fun. It was about planting seeds. Seeds that would one day grow into opportunities she'd seize without him. It's easy to romanticize beginnings, isn't it? To think back and remember only the warmth, the laughter, the passion. But Trevor admits now that he should have seen the warning signs. Meghan wasn't just hungry, she was ravenous. And Hollywood loves the ravenous. But here's the question for you. Do you fault Meghan for using every tool at her disposal, including Trevor? Or do you fault Trevor for not realizing sooner that he wasn't in a love story? He was in a stepping stone story? Because as Meghan began to climb, the distance between them grew. And that's when Trevor started to feel it. Not just the emotional drift of a couple falling apart, but the professional sting of realizing his insider status had become her launch pad. And still, he stayed. Why? Because love blinds us. Because we'd rather believe in loyalty than admit we're being used. Because sometimes the pain of walking away feels worse than the slow drip of betrayal. And for Trevor, the drip continued. The dinners where Meghan was too tired to talk. The parties where she introduced herself before she introduced him. The auditions that felt more like conquests than opportunities. Each one was another sign. Another step toward the truth. But Trevor didn't know the full truth yet. He didn't know that Meghan's ambition wasn't just about breaking into Hollywood. It was about breaking free from him entirely. And that's the moment we're about to reach. Because Trevor wasn't just her support system. He wasn't just her cheerleader. He was the scaffolding she climbed. And when the structure had done its job, she was ready to tear it down. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when the person you've built your world around starts rewriting the script without you in it? That was Trevor Engelson's reality. Because while he still thought of himself as the husband, the partner, the steady anchor behind Meghan's journey, she was quietly reshaping her life in a way that left no room for him. And the biggest irony? Trevor himself had helped sharpen the very tools she was now using to distance herself from him. Let's rewind to those critical years. Meghan was still a relatively unknown actress, bouncing from one small role to another. You might have seen her in the background of a medical drama or delivering a forgettable line in a comedy. She was hustling, no doubt, but she was also hitting the same walls that thousands of hopefuls hit in Los Angeles. The auditions blurred together. The casting calls seemed endless. The doors stayed closed. But here's where Trevor made all the difference. Trevor wasn't just her husband. He became something far more valuable. Her unofficial manager, mentor, and career coach rolled into one. He wasn't taking a cut of her earnings, but he was investing something far more precious: his reputation, his network, his time. Think about it. How many of us have gone the extra mile for someone we love? Driven them to job interviews, helped them practice answers, stayed up late rewriting resumes. Trevor did all of that, except the stage was Hollywood, and the stakes were fame. He was the man standing behind Meghan while she rehearsed lines. He was the one whispering encouragement before she walked into auditions. He was the one who knew which parties mattered, which handshakes could change her trajectory, which introductions could get her noticed. And Meghan took notes. Picture a young Meghan, wide-eyed, dressed perfectly for every occasion, standing slightly behind Trevor as he mingled at industry mixers. Trevor shaking hands, introducing her as his wife, vouching for her talent. Meghan nodding, smiling, making sure her name was remembered. Every handshake, every laugh, every glass of champagne wasn't just socializing, it was strategy. Here's the contradiction that makes this chapter sting. Trevor thought he was giving her love. Meghan treated it like leverage. Let's pause here. Imagine you're Trevor. You've built years of credibility in a cutthroat industry. You've worked to be taken seriously as a producer. Then, you meet someone you love, and you open every door you can for her. You tell yourself it's what any husband would do. But deep down, you start to wonder, does she love me, or does she love the access I provide? It's a question that Trevor admits he ignored, and ignoring it was his second mistake. Because Meghan wasn't content with background roles. She wanted a stage big enough for the world to see her. And that's where Trevor came in, again and again. He helped polish her image. He introduced her to people who could cast her. He gave her advice on how to carry herself in meetings, how to network, how to keep her name floating in the right circles. Have you ever noticed how some people can walk into a room and somehow, hours later, everyone remembers their name? That was Meghan, but with Trevor's guidance. He was the one who explained the politics of the industry, the egos of producers, the expectations of directors. Meghan absorbed it all, then executed flawlessly. But here's the twist. The better Meghan got at the game, the less she seemed to need Trevor in it. That's the cruel irony of ambition. The more he gave her, the faster she outgrew him. Friends of the couple later whispered that Meghan was always on. She wasn't content with just being Trevor's wife. She wanted to be the star of her own show. And little by little, Trevor faded into the background. Let me ask you directly. How would you feel if the person you loved started shining so brightly that you realized their light had no space for yours? Would you keep giving, or would you start pulling back? Trevor kept giving. One night in particular stuck with him. Meghan had landed a meeting that could change everything. She was nervous, pacing the living room, running her lines, her pitch, her smile. Trevor sat there, calm, steady, the voice of reason. "You've got this," he told her. "Just walk in like you already belong." She smiled, kissed him, and walked out the door. That night, Meghan came back glowing. She'd nailed it. The role wasn't confirmed, but she knew she'd made an impression. Trevor hugged her, proud, believing he had helped her inch closer to her dream. But what Trevor didn't know was that his role in her dream was shrinking. Because soon after, Meghan would land the audition that changed everything: Suits. Now, let's put this in perspective. Suits wasn't just another show. It was slick, stylish, and brimming with characters who became instant icons. Landing a role on it wasn't just luck, it was a career breakthrough. And Meghan got it. She became Rachel Zane, the paralegal with ambition and flair. Suddenly, Meghan wasn't just another hopeful in Los Angeles. She was a name, a face, a rising star. But here's the gut punch. Trevor had been the invisible hand guiding her to that point. And the moment Meghan stepped into her spotlight, she began to step out of his shadow. Isn't that the cruelest kind of betrayal? To realize that the success you PR. Isn't that the cruelest kind of betrayal? To realize that the success you prayed for on behalf of your partner is the very thing that pushes them away from you? Trevor's world began to shift. Meghan was flying to Toronto for filming, living a new life on set, surrounded by castmates, soaking up attention, opportunities, and the intoxicating glow of recognition. Trevor stayed in Los Angeles, producing, working, waiting. The phone calls became shorter. The visits became fewer. The distance wasn't just miles, it was emotional. And slowly, Trevor realized what he had done. He had opened doors that led Meghan away from him. Let me ask you this. If you knew your love story would end the moment your partner succeeded, would you still help them? Would you still give them everything, knowing you might lose everything in return? That was the paradox Trevor found himself trapped in. But here's where the story twists again. Because while Trevor was still clinging to the idea of a marriage worth saving, Meghan was already envisioning a life without him. And the way she would reveal that truth wasn't just shocking, it was cold. Because Trevor had believed he was Meghan's foundation. In reality, he had been her scaffolding. And scaffolding is never meant to last. But the way Meghan chose to discard him wasn't just an ending. It was a lesson in ambition at its most ruthless. And when it finally happened, it wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, sharp, and devastating. Because Trevor didn't just lose Meghan. He lost her in a way that made it clear she had never planned on him being part of her future at all. And the story of how she delivered that blow will leave you speechless. What do you do when the love of your life suddenly feels like a stranger? When the person you once laughed with, dreamed with, and built a future with now treats you like an afterthought? That was Trevor Engelson's reality the moment Meghan Markle landed her role on Suits. Because from that point forward, everything began to change, and not in subtle ways. Let's set the stage. For years, Meghan had been grinding it out in Hollywood. Bit parts, brief appearances, forgettable credits. But Suits was different. It wasn't just a role, it was the role. Rachel Zane became her defining character, the face audiences across America came to recognize. And in a matter of months, Meghan went from a struggling actress who leaned on Trevor for every break to an actress who finally had her own leverage. But here's the twist. With that leverage came distance. At first, Trevor tried to be supportive. He was proud, telling friends that Meghan was finally getting the recognition she deserved. He bragged about her success, as any husband would. But behind closed doors, the cracks in their marriage widened. Because filming Suits meant Meghan was living in Toronto for long stretches of time, while Trevor remained in Los Angeles. They were living separate lives, and Meghan thrived in hers while Trevor struggled in his. Let me ask you, have you ever watched someone you love step into a world where you no longer fit? It's painful, isn't it? To realize their new circle, their new rhythm, doesn't leave space for you anymore. That's exactly what Trevor felt. He'd fly to Toronto to visit, expecting intimacy, warmth, the kind of connection couples rekindle after time apart. But what he often found was indifference. Meghan was busy filming, busy networking, busy cultivating her image. She had dinners to attend, events to show up at, co-stars to bond with. And Trevor, once the center of her universe, became background noise. The irony stings. Trevor had been the one to teach her how to navigate Hollywood, how to charm the right people, how to seize opportunities. And now, she was applying all of it, but without him. Friends close to Trevor noticed the change. He began to sound less like a husband talking about his wife, and more like a man trying to convince himself his marriage still mattered. He'd say things like, "She's just busy right now," or, "It'll calm down once the show finds its footing." But the truth was, the show was Meghan's footing. It was the life she had been chasing all along, and Trevor was slowly being written out of the script. Here's the contradiction that cut deepest. Meghan was thriving because of the foundation Trevor had helped her build, but the stronger she became, the less she seemed to need him. Picture this. Meghan on set, glowing under studio lights, laughing with castmates, slipping into the glamorous role of Rachel Zane. Then picture Trevor back in Los Angeles, producing films, grinding through the behind-the-scenes work that doesn't get applause. Two lives running parallel, but no longer connected. And it wasn't just distance and geography. It was emotional. Meghan became sharper, colder, less patient with Trevor's world. She used to lean on him for advice. Now she dismissed his insights with, "I know what I'm doing." She used to ask him to join her at industry events. Now she went alone or with co-stars. Let me ask you directly. How long would you stay in a marriage where every sign pointed to your partner drifting away? Would you fight for it? Or would you accept the inevitable? Trevor fought. At least at first. He sent flowers, arranged trips, tried to remind Meghan of their bond. But Meghan wasn't interested in reminders. She was interested in reinvention. And in her reinvention, Trevor wasn't part of the brand. It's harsh to say, but Trevor admits it now. He became an accessory Meghan no longer wanted to wear. One evening in particular stood out. Trevor flew into Toronto, excited to spend time with his wife. He pictured long dinners, quiet moments, the kind of intimacy that comes after weeks apart. But instead, Meghan was distracted. She was scrolling through scripts, answering calls, preparing for another big event. Trevor sat across from her at dinner, trying to start a conversation, and realized halfway through the meal that she hadn't really looked at him once. That was the moment he knew something had shifted permanently. It's heartbreaking, isn't it? To sit across from someone you love and realize you're no longer the person they're looking at, even when their eyes are on you. From then on, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Meghan became increasingly independent, not in the healthy way of two partners growing stronger side by side, but in the way of one partner sprinting ahead while the other is left behind. She was no longer the woman who leaned on Trevor. She was now the woman who saw him as a weight. The final blow came quietly, the way all devastating betrayals do. While Trevor still clung to the idea of fixing things, Meghan had already decided she was done. And when she finally made her move, it wasn't through a tearful conversation or a painful confrontation. It was colder than that. But before we get to that infamous moment with the mailed ring, think about the symbolism here. Meghan's breakthrough, her golden ticket, was the very thing that marked the beginning of the end for her marriage. Trevor gave her everything she needed to succeed, and that success became the wedge that tore them apart. It's a cruel irony, and Trevor knows it. And it leads us to the question that still lingers. Was Meghan ever really in love with him, or was she in love with what he could provide? Because if love is tested by distance, by struggle, by the grind of everyday life, Meghan's love failed the test. But ambition? Ambition passed with flying colors. And when Meghan finally chose to end it, she did it in a way that left Trevor not just heartbroken, but humiliated. Because what she did next wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was a message. And that message would echo louder than Trevor could have ever imagined. What does it say about a marriage when the woman who once leaned on you for everything now looks at you as if you're in her way? That was the brutal reality Trevor Engelson faced as Meghan Markle's world expanded and his presence shrank into the margins. With suits under her belt and a new identity blossoming, Meghan began to reinvent herself. And Trevor, the man who thought he was her forever, found himself reduced to a footnote. Let's dive deeper into that transformation. In the beginning, Meghan was grateful. She played the role of the supportive wife, thanking Trevor for his sacrifices, leaning on him for guidance. But as the spotlight grew brighter, something inside her shifted. She no longer wanted to be known as Trevor Engelson's wife. She wanted to be known as Meghan Markle, the star. The woman who belonged on magazine covers, not just in Hollywood's background. And here's where the contradiction cuts through the heart of their story. Trevor thought marriage meant partnership, but Meghan saw it as a stepping stone to reinvention. Her lifestyle began to shift dramatically. While Trevor maintained his grounded producer routine, working behind the camera, negotiating contracts, enduring the grind, Meghan was learning to live like the people she admired on screen. Red carpets, designer dresses, carefully curated Instagram posts. Even the way she spoke began to change, smoothing out into the polished cadence of someone training for a bigger stage. Have you ever known someone who started changing themselves so quickly that you barely recognize them anymore? One year they're sitting on the couch eating takeout with you. The next year they're acting as if every detail of life has to be a performance for others. That's what Trevor experienced. The woman who once curled up beside him for movie nights was now obsessing over image consultants, networking dinners, and high society events. And Trevor? He was no longer the center of her attention. He was an accessory to the brand. Here's the irony. Trevor's world was the engine that propelled Meghan into hers. He knew producers, casting directors, insiders. He'd been her guide in the maze of Hollywood. But once Meghan had the map memorized, she no longer needed the guide. And what happens when you no longer need someone? You start resenting them for reminding you of who you used to be. That resentment grew quietly at first. Meghan would snap at Trevor over small things. His work schedule, his lack of fashion sense, his inability to play the game at elite parties the way she could. Friends noticed the tension, but brushed it off as typical marriage stress. Except this wasn't typical. This was a calculated distancing. Think of it like this. Trevor was building a house with bricks. Meghan was already imagining skyscrapers. And when Trevor didn't keep up, she saw him as dead weight. One particularly telling story circulated among their friends. Meghan was invited to a high-profile Hollywood event. Instead of asking Trevor to join her, she showed up alone. When questioned later, she brushed it off. It's just better this way. Better for who? Certainly not for Trevor. But for Meghan, it was another step toward creating her independent brand. Let me pause and ask you this. Would you tolerate being sidelined like that by your spouse? Would you be okay with being excluded from events, from moments, from milestones that should have belonged to both of you? Or would you start to realize the painful truth? That your role in their life had already been rewritten without your consent? For Trevor, it was like death by 1,000 cuts. Each event she attended without him. Each headline that mentioned her but ignored him. Each time she chose a networking dinner over a night at home. Every little decision chipped away at the foundation of their marriage. And then came the emotional divide. Meghan's career began demanding more than just her presence. It demanded her identity. She reinvented herself, not just as an actress, but as a brand. She became meticulous about how she presented herself, always curating her image. Trevor, meanwhile, remained the same. And in Meghan's new world, the same wasn't enough. That's the cruelest irony of ambition, isn't it? It makes yesterday's partner feel like yesterday's news. At dinners, Meghan was distracted. On the phone, she was distant. She no longer looked at Trevor as her teammate. She looked at him as someone who couldn't keep up with her pace. Their conversations weren't about dreams they shared, but about her opportunities, her plans, her future. And when Trevor tried to bring up his own work, Meghan brushed it aside. It wasn't relevant to her vision anymore. The tension escalated when Meghan began criticizing Trevor in subtle but biting ways. His job wasn't glamorous enough. His approach wasn't ambitious enough. His presence wasn't prestigious enough. It's one thing to argue about money or chores. It's another thing when your spouse starts telling you that you aren't enough. Friends say Trevor was blindsided. He still believed they were building a life together, even as Meghan's actions screamed otherwise. He thought the changes were temporary, that once suits settled down, they'd find their rhythm again. But Meghan wasn't looking for rhythm. She was looking for reinvention. And that reinvention had no space for Trevor. The final straw wasn't a screaming match or a dramatic scene. It was something far colder. Meghan's emotional distance turned into physical absence. She started spending less time in Los Angeles, more time in Toronto, and even when Trevor visited, it felt like he was intruding. She had carved out a new life there, a life where he was no longer essential. Can you imagine that pain? Flying across countries to see your spouse, only to realize you're visiting someone who has already moved on from you emotionally? It was in those quiet moments, those empty dinners and hollow conversations, that Trevor realized the truth. Meghan wasn't just drifting away. She was cutting him out. And soon, she would do it in the most shocking, humiliating way possible. Because Trevor thought he was still in the story. But Meghan was already writing him out. And the way she delivered that final edit would leave him stunned. What kind of love story ends not with a bang, but with a cold, calculated silence? By the time Meghan Markle had fully stepped into her new identity. Red carpets, photo ops, the polished star of Suits, Trevor Engelson was no longer her partner. He was her past. And the way she let him know? It was as ruthless as it was heartbreaking. Let's rewind to the final months before their split. On the surface, their marriage wasn't in crisis. At least, not in the dramatic, plate-smashing, door-slamming way you'd expect. There were no tabloid scandals, no screaming arguments in public. It was quieter than that. More insidious. Meghan had simply detached. She no longer turned to Trevor for comfort, advice, or even companionship. She was living her life, and he was just watching it happen. But here's where it gets cruel. Meghan didn't just stop leaning on Trevor. She began pushing him away, subtly at first, then openly. Imagine this. Trevor flying to Toronto after weeks apart, eager to see his wife, only to find her distracted, cold, preoccupied. She'd go through the motions, dinner, small talk, maybe a polite smile, but the intimacy was gone. That sparkle in her eyes when she looked at him had been replaced by something else, calculation, distance. And Trevor, bless his heart, tried. He still believed this was a rough patch, something they could work through. He thought once Meghan's schedule lightened, once the frenzy of her rising career slowed, they'd reconnect. That was his hope. His mistake. Because Meghan wasn't planning to reconnect. She was planning her exit. Friends noticed it before Trevor did. Meghan started making comments about how different their lives were. How Trevor just didn't understand her new world. How she needed space to grow. Harmless words on the surface, but deadly when strung together. It was the language of someone who had already decided the relationship was over. She was just waiting for the right moment to make it official. Now, here's where the betrayal turns sharp. When Meghan finally decided to end the marriage, she didn't sit Trevor down. She didn't offer him the dignity of a conversation, a chance to plead his case, or even a mutual understanding. Instead, she mailed back her wedding rings. Yes, mailed. Like a package. As if their years together, their wedding, their vows, were no more meaningful than an Amazon return. Let me ask you, can you imagine the humiliation of opening an envelope and finding the symbol of your marriage shoved inside? No explanation. No closure. Just metal in a box and silence in the air. That single act told Trevor everything he needed to know. To Meghan, their marriage wasn't worth even the courtesy of a face-to-face goodbye. It was transactional, disposable, the kind of thing you end with postage, not with compassion. And that act still haunts Trevor. Because it wasn't just a breakup, it was an erasure. Meghan had cut him out as efficiently as she had used him to climb. She didn't owe him gratitude, in her mind. She didn't owe him explanation. She owed him nothing. The symbolism of that moment is staggering. The ring that once represented forever now represented finality. It was the coldest move possible, and Trevor admits it crushed him. Not because he didn't see the distance growing. He did. But because the woman he thought he knew was capable of something so dismissive, so dehumanizing. Here's the contradiction. Meghan had been all warmth and charm in public. The smiling wife. The supportive partner. But when it came time to end things, there was no warmth left. Only efficiency. Only ambition. It begs the question, was Meghan ever truly in love with Trevor, or was she in love with the access he provided until she no longer needed it? The timing, too, was telling. Meghan's career was peaking. She had financial stability, recognition, a new life in Toronto. She didn't need Trevor's Hollywood connections anymore. In fact, his presence may have even reminded her of the years she wanted to forget. The years of struggle, of rejection, of anonymity. By leaving him behind, she was leaving behind her old self. And yet, Trevor wasn't prepared for the way it happened. Who would be? Even his friends were shocked. Some said Meghan's exit was cold-blooded. Others admitted they weren't surprised, given how her ambitions had consumed her. But all agreed on one thing. Trevor deserved better. Have you ever had someone walk out of your life without explanation, leaving you with nothing but unanswered questions? That's what Trevor endured. Only magnified 1,000 times by the fact that this wasn't just a friend or colleague. This was his wife. The woman he had believed in. The woman he had built his life around. It left him hollow, humiliated, and worst of all, wondering if any of it had been real. That's the cruelest part, isn't it? To not only lose someone you love, but to question whether they ever truly loved you back. Trevor has since admitted that Meghan's decision cut deeper than any professional betrayal he's faced. Because it wasn't just about the marriage ending. It was about the way it ended. About the message she sent by choosing an envelope over empathy. And that message? It was clear. You were useful until you weren't. But here's where the story twists again. Because Meghan's ambition didn't stop at leaving Trevor. In fact, her departure was only the first step in a far grander reinvention. Because once Meghan had cut ties with Trevor, she wasn't just free of him. She was free to chase something far bigger than Hollywood. And the next chapter of her life would be. How do you measure betrayal? Is it in the cold act of mailing a ring? Or is it in the realization that the person you loved had already emotionally left you long before the envelope ever arrived? For Trevor Engelson, both were true. But as devastating as Meghan Markle's exit was, the aftermath, the way she moved on without hesitation, made the wound cut even deeper. The divorce wasn't dramatic in legal terms. There were no messy court battles splashed across tabloids, no financial wars that dragged on for years. On paper, it was neat, efficient, just as Meghan seemed to prefer. But in Trevor's heart, it was chaos. He was blindsided, humiliated, and above all, left asking a single question. How could someone he gave so much to discard him so easily? Let's slow down here. Because this wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the beginning of Meghan's next act. After mailing back the rings, Meghan didn't crumble in private. She didn't retreat, mourn, or pause. She surged forward. She dove headfirst into her career, her social image, her carefully crafted reinvention. For Meghan, ending her marriage wasn't the conclusion of a love story. It was the removal of an obstacle. That's a hard truth, isn't it? The realization that someone you loved saw you not as a forever, but as a chapter they needed to close so they could write a better story without you in it. Meanwhile, Trevor was left in the ruins. He tried to carry on, to focus on work, to hide the ache. But those who knew him say he was shaken in a way that went beyond heartbreak. It wasn't just losing Meghan. It was realizing she had never really been his to lose. She had been hers all along, driven, ambitious, calculating. And Trevor had been useful until he wasn't. Have you ever been blindsided by someone's coldness? One moment you're planning the future, the next moment you realize they had already moved on in their mind months ago. That was Trevor's reality. What makes Meghan's move even more shocking is the way she reframed her own narrative afterward. Publicly, she never painted herself as the ambitious climber who used Trevor to climb Hollywood's ladder. Instead, she spun the story as one of personal growth, independence, and reinvention. She became the heroine of her own tale. And Trevor? He was erased. A forgotten footnote. Think about that. A man who had poured years of his life, his love, and his professional reputation into supporting her was written out of the script of her life as though he'd never been there. The mailed rings weren't just a message, they were a metaphor. Meghan was done with him, done with that chapter, and ready for her next move. And what a move it was. Because after the divorce, Meghan didn't simply continue as a TV actress. She set her sights higher. She built her brand. She began curating her social media with inspirational quotes, humanitarian angles, and carefully polished images of herself as not just an actress, but a woman of substance. It was her way of signaling to the world, I am more than Hollywood. Here's the painful irony for Trevor. While he was licking his wounds, trying to piece together the shards of his marriage, Meghan was already climbing into circles that would one day connect her with royalty. Let me ask you this. Have you ever felt like you were replaced so quickly that it made you question whether you ever mattered at all? That's what Trevor faced. Meghan didn't just leave him. She moved on in a way that made it clear she had been preparing for life after him long before the papers were signed. It's almost chilling, isn't it? The efficiency, the precision, the way she severed ties with Trevor like cutting a rope and immediately grabbed onto another rung of the ladder. And Trevor, despite his pain, remained silent for years. He didn't go on talk shows, didn't give tell-all interviews, didn't drag Meghan through the mud. He swallowed his heartbreak and stayed in the shadows. Some might call that dignity. Others might call it paralysis. But either way, it gave Meghan the space to rewrite the story without his interference. But here's where the contradiction hits hardest. Meghan portrayed herself as the woman who fought against adversity, who climbed against the odds. Yet behind the scenes, Trevor knew he had been the odds breaker. He had been the one opening doors, smoothing paths, building bridges. And when those bridges had carried her far enough, she burned them without looking back. That's betrayal on a level most of us can barely imagine. Now picture this. You've lost your wife, you've lost your partner, and you've lost your place in her story. Everywhere you look, she's on magazine covers, glowing on red carpets, praised for her resilience. And you? You're the ghost of a marriage no one remembers. How do you move forward from that? For Trevor, the answer was slow, painful. But in his silence, in his heartbreak, there was also a lesson, a realization. Meghan had revealed who she truly was, not in words, but in actions. And those actions told Trevor the truth he admits now at 48. She used him to climb. But here's the twist. While Meghan's story was accelerating toward royalty, Trevor's was taking a very different turn. And in that turn, there was something Meghan didn't expect. Because though she had cut him out coldly, though she had erased him from her narrative, Trevor would find a way not just to survive, but to thrive. But what came next in Meghan's life, and how it tied back to Trevor's silence, would ignite a storm no one could have predicted. What happens when the woman who once shared your bed, your secrets, your dreams, suddenly reinvents herself into someone unrecognizable, and the whole world applauds? That's the question Trevor Engelson faced as Meghan Markle didn't just walk away from their marriage, but stepped into a carefully crafted new life that made his existence feel irrelevant. By the time Meghan's career was peaking, she wasn't just an actress on Suits anymore. She was becoming a brand. And that brand had no room for Trevor. But the story doesn't end with mailed rings and silent heartbreak. In fact, that was just the beginning. Because Meghan's ambitions were never confined to Hollywood alone. The world had no idea yet, but Meghan's sights were already set on something far bigger, far shinier, far more untouchable than fame in Los Angeles. She was preparing herself for royalty. Now pause for a moment and think about that. How many actresses dream of breaking through in Hollywood? Hundreds of thousands. How many dream of marrying into royalty? Almost none. That's a fairy tale too far, right? But not for Meghan. And Trevor? He would be the ghost she left behind on her way to the palace gates. After the divorce, Meghan immersed herself fully in her new identity. She sharpened her humanitarian image, cultivated a lifestyle blog, surrounded herself with influencers and celebrities who added sparkle to her reputation. Every move seemed designed not just to boost her career, but to erase Trevor from her story. No ex-husband, no Hollywood producer, just Meghan, the independent, unstoppable woman. And Trevor? He was forced to watch it unfold. Imagine turning on the television and seeing your ex-wife smiling on red carpets, delivering speeches, presenting herself as a self-made woman, all while knowing you had been the scaffolding she climbed to get there. Imagine the sting of hearing the media describe her as an overnight success, when you know the truth. That success had been built brick by brick, with your hands, your contacts, your sacrifices. Let me ask you this. If you were Trevor, would you feel proud? Or would you feel erased? For years, Trevor kept silent. He didn't tell his side of the story. He didn't reveal the coldness of the mailed rings, the calculated detachment that ended their marriage. Instead, he swallowed it. Maybe out of dignity. Maybe out of shock. Maybe because the wound was too raw to speak of. But that silence came at a cost. Meghan's narrative took center stage. And Trevor was reduced to a footnote, the ex-husband. But as Meghan's trajectory climbed, as she began dating Prince Harry, as she made headlines not just in entertainment, but across the globe, the whispers about Trevor grew louder. Who was this man she left behind? What had really happened in that marriage? Why did she walk away so coldly? The irony is almost unbearable. The same silence that had protected Meghan's reputation for years became the very thing that piqued curiosity about Trevor. People wanted to know, what did he think? What did he know? And here's where the contradiction turns brutal. Meghan had carefully reinvented herself as a woman of compassion, a humanitarian with a heart for the downtrodden. Yet behind that image was a man she had discarded without a word. The story of the mailed rings began leaking into tabloids. Friends of Trevor, unwilling to see him erased completely, began to speak. The narrative Meghan had tried to bury started resurfacing, and slowly, the cracks in her fairy tale began to show. Have you ever noticed that the past has a way of catching up with people, no matter how far they run? That's what happened here. Meghan might have believed she could erase Trevor, but his truth didn't vanish. It lingered in whispers, resurfaced in gossip, and now, at 48, Trevor has chosen to admit it plainly. Meghan used him. Used him for connections. Used him for auditions. Used him to break into Hollywood. And once she was strong enough to stand alone, she discarded him like yesterday's news. That's not a love story. That's a strategy. And when Meghan entered the royal stage, the contrast between the fairy tale the public saw and the reality Trevor lived through became almost unbearable. Think about it. Millions swooning over the prince and the actress, the picture-perfect romance, while Trevor watched, knowing the truth that had been buried under the glitz. Can you imagine that pain? Watching your ex-wife marry into royalty while you're still processing the fact that she mailed back her wedding rings? It's not just heartbreak. It's humiliation on a global scale. But here's where the story takes another twist. Meghan may have tried to bury Trevor in silence, but Trevor's quiet dignity, his refusal to sling mud immediately, only made his eventual admission more powerful. When he finally spoke, it wasn't out of bitterness. It was out of truth, out of release, out of the need to finally say what he'd carried for years. And that truth was simple. Meghan Markle was never really his wife in the way he imagined. She was a woman on a mission, and he had been a tool in her arsenal. That's the heartbreak. That's the betrayal. That's the confession that cuts through the fairy tale gloss and reveals the cold machinery behind it. But before we dive deeper into how Meghan's royal reinvention clashed with the shadow of her Hollywood past, let's linger here on Trevor's silence. Because silence isn't just absence. Silence speaks. It tells you something about the depth of the wound. And when Trevor finally broke that silence, years later, it didn't just expose Meghan. It exposed an entire system, an industry, a monarchy, a culture that rewards ambition, even when it comes at the cost of those left behind. And what Trevor reveals next isn't just about Meghan. It's about all of us who've ever given everything to someone, only to realize we were never part of their endgame. But the next chapter of Meghan's journey, the leap from actress to princess, will prove that Trevor's heartbreak was only the beginning of her calculated climb. What do you do after your heart has been shattered, your marriage discarded, and your identity erased from someone else's story? For Trevor Engelson, the years after Meghan Markle mailed him her rings weren't just about heartbreak. They were about rebuilding, reclaiming, learning how to live without the weight of betrayal pressing down on him every day. And while Meghan sprinted into her next act, royalty, global fame, the glossy illusion of a fairy tale romance, Trevor took a slower, quieter, but ultimately more authentic path. This is the part of the story that often gets overlooked. People love to talk about Meghan's climb from actress to duchess, but few stop to ask, what happened to the man she left behind? What became of Trevor Engelson, the Hollywood producer whose life had been entangled with hers for nearly a decade? The answer is complex. At first, Trevor was crushed. He'd been humiliated not just by the abruptness of the split, but by the coldness of it. Imagine believing you were in a love story, only to discover you'd been in a transaction. That realization doesn't just bruise your heart, it bruises your sense of self. Friends say Trevor went quiet, withdrawn. He buried himself in work, in producing, in projects that kept him busy but didn't fill the void. Nights felt longer, mornings felt emptier. Because heartbreak isn't just about missing someone. It's about missing the version of yourself you thought existed when you were with them. And Trevor had to wrestle with the fact that the man Meghan loved may have never really existed at all. Let me ask you this. Have you ever questioned your worth after someone discarded you? Not because of what you did wrong, but because of what they were chasing? That's the kind of soul-deep pain Trevor carried. But here's where his story takes a surprising turn. Over time, Trevor didn't just survive. He started to thrive. He rebuilt his life, piece by piece, not by chasing headlines, but by seeking something Meghan had never given him: authenticity. Trevor found love again, this time with someone outside the Hollywood circus. He married Tracy Corland, a nutritionist, in 2019. Their wedding wasn't a flashy spectacle designed for cameras. It was intimate, grounded, and real. In that moment, Trevor stepped out of Meghan's shadow for good. He wasn't the ex-husband of a duchess. He was a man starting fresh, with a partner who wanted him for him, not for what he could provide. Isn't there something poetic about that? Meghan, the woman who used Trevor as a ladder, found herself in a world where every move is scrutinized, criticized, dissected. Meanwhile, Trevor, the man she left behind, found peace in a simpler, quieter life. One could argue he won in the end. But don't mistake Trevor's peace for forgetfulness. Because while he built a new life, he never forgot the way Meghan left him. He never forgot the mailed rings, the cold detachment, the humiliation of being written out of her narrative. And that memory is what fueled his eventual confession. At 48, Trevor finally admitted what he had carried for years: Meghan used him. And when he said those words, it wasn't out of bitterness. It wasn't revenge. It was release. Because Trevor had learned something in the years since. Sometimes, the truth is the only closure you'll ever get. Meghan never gave him that closure. But by speaking it himself, Trevor claimed it. The irony is staggering. Meghan had risen to royalty, but her story was built on foundations Trevor had laid. Without him, without his connections, his support, his guidance, her climb would have been far steeper, far slower, perhaps even impossible. Yet, when she stood at the altar with Prince Harry, when she smiled for the cameras as the world called her a fairy tale princess, Trevor's name was nowhere to be found. And maybe that's why his admission matters so much. Because it shatters the illusion. It forces us to ask, How many fairy tales are really built on untold betrayals? Have you ever looked back on a relationship and realized you were just a chapter in someone else's story, never the whole book? That's Trevor's truth. And now, at 48, he owns it. But here's the part Meghan never expected. By moving on so quickly, by chasing bigger and shinier prizes, she underestimated the one thing Trevor could do that would outlast her ambition: heal. He built a new family, a new identity, a new life that wasn't tethered to her. He walked through the fire, and instead of being burned, he came out refined. And yet, Meghan's shadow never completely disappeared. Every time she made headlines, whether for royal drama, family feuds, or Hollywood deals, the whispers about Trevor resurfaced. People remembered the man she left behind, the marriage that ended with a mailed ring, the producer who had been the first rung on her ladder. And those whispers kept Trevor's story alive. But what makes Trevor's silence, and eventual admission, so powerful is this: he didn't need to scream. He didn't need to drag Meghan publicly through the mud. He just needed to tell the truth. And the truth is damning enough. Because if Meghan could treat the man who gave her everything with such cold calculation, what does that say about the woman she became when the stakes grew even higher? That question lingers, doesn't it? And it leads us directly into the next chapter. Because while Trevor rebuilt his life with quiet dignity, Meghan was embarking on a new path, one that would make the mailed rings look like child's play compared to the storm that was about to come. Because Meghan wasn't done climbing. She wasn't done reinventing. And Trevor's heartbreak, as devastating as it was only the prologue to the most ambitious leap of all. And that leap would take her out of Hollywood and straight into Buckingham Palace. What happens when silence becomes too heavy to carry? When the truth you've kept buried for years starts to eat at you until you can no longer hold it back? That's where Trevor Engelson found himself as he approached his late 40s. For years, he had stayed quiet while Meghan Markle reinvented herself as royalty, a humanitarian, and a global celebrity. He never interrupted the fairy tale, never corrected the narrative. But silence, my friend, has a weight. And for Trevor, that weight eventually became unbearable. By 48, he had lived an entirely different life than the one Meghan had scripted for herself. He had remarried. He had found stability, even joy. He had started a family far from the noise of red carpets and palace scandals. But despite moving forward, there was still a part of him that hadn't healed, the part that had never spoken. And when Trevor finally admitted the truth, that Meghan had used him to climb in Hollywood, he didn't do it out of spite. He did it because holding it in had become a prison. Let's put this in perspective. Imagine watching your ex become one of the most famous women in the world, celebrated for her resilience, her independence, her rise from obscurity. Now imagine knowing that much of that rise was built on your back, your connections, your reputation, your sacrifices. And yet, the world never hears your name. Would you stay silent forever? Or would you eventually break? Trevor broke. His admission wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted from the rooftops or scrawled across tabloids. It was calm, almost weary. "She used me," he said. Simple words, devastating meaning. And in that sentence, years of unspoken betrayal finally surfaced. Here's the contradiction that makes his confession so powerful. Meghan had spent years presenting herself as the victim of circumstance, the woman who survived a tough childhood, who fought her way into Hollywood, who battled prejudice and criticism to claim her place in the world. And in some ways, those things were true. But what she never acknowledged was the stepping stones she had used along the way. Trevor was one of those stepping stones. The irony is staggering. Meghan's entire brand is built on empowerment, on being self-made. But Trevor's truth exposes the cracks in that image. Because if she was truly self-made, why did she need him to get ahead? Why did she discard him so abruptly once she had climbed far enough? That's the part Meghan doesn't want the world to see. That her fairy tale wasn't built on independence alone. It was built on sacrifice. Someone else's sacrifice. And that's why Trevor's words matter so much. But here's the twist. Trevor's confession didn't come during Meghan's climb. It came after she had reached the peak, after she had been crowned with titles, after she had basked in royal grandeur, after she had fallen into controversy. In a way, his timing was poetic. He didn't need to interrupt her rise. He waited until her mask was already cracking, until the world was already questioning her narrative. Then, with a single truth, he added fuel to the fire. Have you ever noticed how timing can make a truth even more powerful? It's not just what Trevor said, it's when he said it. And let's be clear, Trevor isn't a bitter man clinging to the past. He's not throwing stones from the sidelines. He's someone who has rebuilt his life, who has found peace, who has no need for Meghan anymore. That's what makes his admission sting even more. Because he didn't say it to hurt her. He said it because it was true. Think about that. When someone who has nothing left to gain finally speaks, that's when you know the truth is real. But let's not forget the ripple effect. Trevor's confession doesn't just expose Meghan. It forces everyone to re-examine her entire trajectory. If she could use him, discard him, and erase him so easily, who else did she use along the way? Which friendships? Which connections? Which opportunities were built on the same kind of cold calculation? It makes you wonder, how much of Meghan's story is truly hers, and how much of it was borrowed, lifted, or taken from those she left behind? That's the haunting question Trevor's truth leaves hanging in the air. And here's where the emotional beat hits hardest. Trevor's story isn't just about Meghan. It's about every person who has ever given everything to someone, only to realize they were never meant to be part of that person's endgame. It's about the partners who sacrifice, the friends who support, the loved ones who lift others up, only to be forgotten once success comes. Have you ever been that person? Have you ever wondered if the love you gave was real, or if it was just a transaction for the other person? That's the sting Trevor lived with for years. And now, by admitting the truth, he's not just freeing himself, he's warning others. Warning us. But don't think for a second that Meghan's story ends here. Trevor's admission is powerful, yes, but it also sets the stage for a much bigger reckoning. Because while he finally freed himself by speaking, Meghan was still ensnared in the biggest gamble of her life, royalty. And the cracks that Trevor exposed in their marriage? Those same cracks would begin to show in her royal life too. Because if she could discard Trevor when she no longer needed him, what would stop her from doing the same to anyone else, prince or not? And that's where the story begins to collide.